The issue with fluid reasoning is generally framed from the perspective of CHC. There's three subtypes: inductive, deductive, and quantitative. But the issue with it is it focuses on abstract reasoning too much, and there's more to fluid reasoning than abstract reasoning.
Today, we have not one, but two very special guests with us. Today, I have both Drs. Milton Dehn and Carl Romstad. Dr. Dehn was a practicing school psychologist and an associate professor and school psychology program director at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse until his retirement. Currently, he is the test development project director for Schoolhouse Educational Services. His interests include assessment of cognitive abilities, memory, dyslexia, and executive functions, and using a pattern of strengths and weaknesses to identify specific learning disabilities. Carl Romstad is a licensed school psychologist and licensed special education director in the state of Minnesota. He holds a Master of Science and Education Specialist degree in school psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Stout. He obtained a special education director licensure from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. He has worked for over 10 years as a practicing school psychologist and for 3 years as a practicing special education director in Minnesota. Carl's clinical services combined his knowledge of assessment tools and methods and his experience and knowledge of special education policies and procedures to help him work with higher needs clients experiencing academic-related issues or seeking more information related to special education and/or 504 services. Outside of his work as a school psychologist and special education director, Carl also has co-published, co-researched with professionals at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, regarding issues in diversity and special education, has consulted with and trained professionals through the Minnesota Department of Education, and has co-researched and developed new methods of assessing problem solving and reasoning in various populations of students with unique backgrounds and special needs in public education and clinical settings. I'm honored to have you both here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I typically start my interviews by asking about favorite TV shows that you are watching. With all of the work both of you are putting into creating new tests, do either of you actually have any time to watch TV? And if so, what are your favorite TV shows you're watching right now? I'll start with you, Carl.
That's a really good question. Do I have time to watch TV? I have 3 daughters. So by the time I get done with work, pick them up from school, feed them, help them with homework, there sometimes is time to watch TV. And if my wife and I are fortunate enough to have that time, we'll sit down and we'll stream something, whatever new show, miniseries, whatever. But if it were on my own, there's a new streaming, I think it's a channel or something called The Great Courses. So I like to watch instructors lecture on historical topics or things about sociology or psychology or something like that. Very, very boring. None of my kids would watch it with me. My wife won't watch it with me. It's just very dry. But for me, I just love getting the information. So some people would call that a nerd. I don't care what you call it, but I like learning more about the social sciences. So, yeah.
That's incredible. I didn't even know that channel existed.
Oh, it's awesome. Awesome.
Awesome. And what about you, Milt?
Well, in the evenings, I like to sit and watch TV with my wife when I stop working for the day. And on game shows on network TV, enjoying those, can guess the answer before the contestants do that. Those are always fun. But a series to binge on, a recorded TV series, my favorite one for the past year was Suits. And because of the characters, the character development, the relationships, and Meghan Markle was in there, early on. But I really got done that series. So, yes, I do watch some TV and, of course, Netflix movies and that kind of thing, too.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to ask both of you in one sentence, how would your colleagues have described you when you were in your role as a school psychologist? Milt, do you want to go first on this one?
Well, I think they would have described me as parent-friendly. That was always something I focused on when we had interviews or team meetings with parents. And I think that would be the primary thing, and I've gotten that kind of feedback, flexible maybe, you know, listening to the team, not just going off and doing my own thing all the time. And in my last position, halftime position, while I was at the university, I was in a high school setting, and my office was right in the counseling office with the guidance counselors. I really enjoyed that, being part of that team. So,
Wonderful. Carl.
This was a good question, and I had to reach out. So the last time I was actually in the schools, it was a charter school world, probably about roughly 2.5 years ago. And I worked with a woman named Nicole Trent. I missed working with her. She was great. We worked in quite a few different schools together. So I asked her, Nikki, I have this podcast and this is the question. And it took her a little bit. And I know she didn't want to hurt my feelings or anything. And I told her, just be honest. Don't ruin my weekend, but tell me the truth. So in her words, she said, Carl Romstad is a school psychologist who is professional in his work, open to thinking outside the box, and willing to challenge outdated, ineffective practices. So that is how she would describe me. Now, I'm sure if you ask my new boss, Chris Boyes, or Dr. Chris Boyes of the Great Lakes Neurobehavioral Center, I'm sure he would say something along the same lines, but I can read people's mind and I know they're thinking impulsive. I know I'm inattentive. I know I'm impulsive with some things, but I think that's why I am where I am, because you just jump at it, go for it. You've got a gut feeling about something. You can sit around and wait and think about it, but if it feels right, just do it. So
I think it was interesting that your colleague brought up your desire to question outdated practices. Like, I think it's interesting that colleagues would see that about you. Like, that's obviously something so passionate that other people around you obviously would describe you as someone who really thinks in that way.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead because I know there are other interview questions, but the one predicating factor with all of this research was just a personal devotion to it, my personal life and how this sort of trickled into that, and not wanting to cause, I don't want to cause problems in questioning things, but when something is obvious and no one's really doing much, it's like, why not? What are we missing? What am I missing here? Why haven't we tried this? So anyway, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but yeah.
Well, both of you have been part of this amazing field for many, many years. I'm curious, at what point did test development decide to be part of your focus? Carl, I'll let you go first this time.
I was thinking Dr. Dehn would go. So this really goes back to, I don't know how far back I should go, and I could ramble. I really, really could. When I did my EDS thesis, it really had to do with cultural bias in the field of psychology. Psychology is a social science. It's not a natural science. So everything that we're doing, it's not mathematically sound. It's a group of people decided that this was correct. So we're going to go with it. And I won't ramble too much about that. So as time progressed and I was a practicing school psych, I had that spark in my mind that maybe things are not what they seem. Maybe there needs to be improvement in this field. So as I began testing more and more and getting data, I would say the idea of test creation came up in 2016. That's probably when I told myself, I have data, I need to get this out somewhere. And I think the only way to move forward would be somehow to create a test, somehow. So not to get too long-winded, but 2016 is probably when it began for me.
And Dr. Dehn, I know this isn't the first test you've been a part of in regards to test development. When did your passion for this really begin?
Well, I think in 2010, I was kind of working on the early stages of PSW then. And my thought was, can we collect some data on the cognitive ability of students without performance-based testing? And actually, this even relates to the rule with African-American intellectual testing in California, the Larry P. case. And so my brainstorm was, can we do a teacher and parent rating that gets at things such as auditory processing, fluid reasoning, based on the observations, of the parents and teachers. And so I got lucky. Dr. Kevin McGrew agreed to be my mentor and unofficial co-author on this. And so he really taught me one-on-one about test development, and that
Mm.
really got me hooked on it. And, the scale worked out, and, it's still out there. A lot of people in California actually use it. It's the Children's Psychological Processes Scale. And it was digital, so I thought I was innovative at the time. Of course, everything is digital now. When it came out in 2012, it was one of the few tests that were actually normed digitally to begin with.
I know I talk about that test frequently in regards to what a wonderful way either to use it on its own or to really clarify that ecological validity of our standardized testing results, right? So we get lower scores in an area. Is that something that the teacher actually sees in the educational setting as well to make us always feel more comfortable and confident going into those meetings? So I love that tool. Well, the assessment of nonverbal contextual reasoning is why we're chatting today. And this new test that is coming out soon is focused on fluid reasoning. Why do you think the field need a new test that covers this topic?
Well, the issue with fluid reasoning, and it's generally framed from the perspective of CHC.
Mhm.
There's three subtypes: inductive, deductive, and quantitative. But the issue with it is it focuses on abstract reasoning too much, and there's more to fluid reasoning than abstract reasoning. We also use fluid reasoning in our daily problem solving and reasoning, but we don't emphasize that or measure it or attempt to measure it directly on
Yeah.
cognitive ability tests. And so it's contextual reasoning is what we're focusing on, but it's not alien to fluid reasoning. Talk to one of the CHC experts, and, logically it makes sense that contextual reasoning can't be considered part of fluid reasoning. So I guess it's kind of the part of fluid reasoning that we think has been ignored. And the outcome has been that we often underestimate or misunderstand the full reasoning potential of some students, especially those, who are not, in a more formal education system and have been trained to use abstract reasoning, such as going through matrices.
Mhm.
So, yes, fluid reasoning, but, a special part of fluid reasoning.
Carl, what would you like to add to that?
So 100% on what Dr. Dehn said. And I would say as long as we're seeing an abilities gap or a performance gap on assessments that are deemed culture fair and culture free, that term, it gets thrown around a lot. When we go to state conferences and national conferences, the term cultural input determines cognitive output, and then it stops there. It's this platitude that gets dropped. And that's really what it's become. And we don't really move forward from that. But when we see the gaps in performance, like the Larry P, 15 points, where 85 is the new 100. And then we see newer research that has the same thing, where disenfranchised groups are just doing that much, or their 85 is the new 100. So the research that I did in 2017 with the Hmong students in Minnesota was the same thing. So as long as we see that, I think it's time to consider making a new assessment that can measure GF, which we're never going to get away from, but in a different way, a way that is going to be, approachable from all groups. Every group is going to be able to do this assessment and do it at the same rate or get the same performance. And that's easy for me to say, not easy to do. But I'm shocked that this hasn't happened soon, really. This goes back to the mid-'80s, where James Flynn coined the Flynn effect, where he saw secular IQ gains across groups, and he said that this was cultural input that did this. So we've known this for how long? That exposure is really, really going to determine how a group does in an IQ test. Even more, I'm not going to say frustrating, but concerning is the mathematical and symbolic logic that we see in these culture-free tests. This is the most biased part of all of them, because if you're not brought up to think that way in a formal sense or an abstract sense, like Dr. Dehn was mentioning, you're not going to do well in these assessments. And we've just known this for how long? So yeah, I guess not to ramble, but to go back to the question, why do you think the field needs a test to cover this topic? Because we see a gap in performance. And
Mm.
until we don't see that gap, I think we have to keep working.
Well, I find it interesting because when we think about different parts of our assessment tools, if you think about a lot more of our verbal subtest, right, or GC, we think about that being very culturally influenced. Even the definition of what that is, it's based on one's culture, but it's the culture of the people making the test, not the students themselves. But a lot of psychologists that I've spoken to, we think of the fluid reasoning tests. We think of matrix reasoning and those types of tests as being more culture free. And when we think about fluid reasoning, again, part of the definition is this novelty to these kind of tests. Most kids don't walk around doing matrices all day long, but it seems like both of you have noticed there's this gap with certain populations. So with this new tool, how do you see school psychologists utilizing this maybe alongside their other tools or in place of? Like, which populations have you found that this to be a very useful tool for?
Well, population-wise, start back into the question. So our data is showing nearly equivalent performance between different populations and samples. And ELL students, we have lots of Spanish-speaking ELL students in our sample. Works really well for them. They're pretty much performing at an equivalent level as white middle-class students, for example, in comparison when we do a matched subject analysis. Also, African Americans are doing very similarly throughout the test, has 4 subtests, and the total score is very, very minimal differences. Those would be 2 big populations. There's also a population that across the U.S. is often referred to as SLIFE, and I know this is not a California term, but SLIFE stands for students with limited and interrupted formal education, such as, maybe refugees from Ukraine or refugees from Africa, and they come to the U.S. We've had this contact recently from a major U.S. school district that has tens of thousands of these students a year. And, how do we screen them? How do we figure out, what their potential is likely to be? We can't come in and give them a typical cognitive test. And so those are the kind of populations that we're focusing on. And we think it's really working with them. So I kind of stole that part of the answer. I'll let Carl handle the first part of the question.
So when I was a practicing psych, I'm going to back up and I'm just going to, establish a little bit of a, scenario. When I was a practicing school psych, I remember giving an assessment. And before I would speak to parents, if we had an interpreter, I would really have to pardon the results ahead of time, saying that, that we gave this assessment, but it might not be the best representation of how this person processes because of the standardization and things like that. So you're apologizing before you even give the results. And I remember years ago, we had an interpreter in one of the charter schools, and I said that, and the parent spoke to the interpreter looked at me, and she said, the parents want to know why you gave the assessment to their child if it's not the best assessment that was available. And right there was a 2-second pause, and it felt like 2 hours. It was the longest pause in my life. And I shrugged. I didn't know what to say. I was a new psych, and I just said, tell the parents this was the only thing that was available. And the parents just looked at me like, okay. So imagine if you didn't have to do that. If the psych got to sit down and the psych got to say, we have really, really good assessments, and we were able to look at your child's formal thinking and contextual thinking. We got the entire picture. So then they can say, yes, the formal thinking of your child might not be the best representation of how they reason, but this is how they formally reason nonetheless. Now we can also say contextually, this is how that child reasons as well. So you're giving the whole picture. You're not pardoning results, and you're telling the parents, we did 100% of the tasks that we were set out to do. Right now, going forward, I joke with my wife that if I ever did go back to the schools and I had to give assessments, I wouldn't be able to do it without my mind going absolutely crazy, because knowing that there's another side to this reasoning coin that we haven't measured. And right now, to only measure one side is as absurd as thinking the earth is flat. this is a spherical concept. So let's get the other side of the reasoning coin, the other side of the reasoning globe. Let's measure that so we can tell parents this is how they absolutely do it.
If I could add to that, how sites would use it, we see it as a supplemental, important supplemental test. For example, it's like, you get some phonemic awareness scores from maybe a Woodcock or a different achievement test, and you follow up in more depth with the CTOP to really take a look at all aspects or different aspects of that. So it'd be similar to that, after you do your normal cognitive assessment, you do this one to look at the more informal, less abstract, concrete, contextual reasoning, and then you would compare it. And in our data, we're seeing, pretty commonly, we did a subset where we gave some of the students the Ravens, which is very abstract. It's kind of like fluid reasoning on steroids. And we see lots of kids get, like an 80-ish Ravens looking like they're low average reasoning. And then on our scale, they come in at around 100, perfectly average when we're looking at the other side of reasoning. So that would be the benefit, be looking at it as CHC people would say, it's kind of like looking at the narrow abilities, but it's more than just a narrow.
And when I share results with some people and we talk about the lower SES disenfranchised kids and how well they do, the first thing is people say, well, why do you think that is? And it used to be where I thought, we're not quite sure. And no, we're absolutely sure, because it goes back to how they're giving the assessment. This is how they learn. All of the methods that we use when we're measuring contextual reasoning, it's not just what they're looking at, it's how you're interacting with that student when you're giving the assessment. So really to be able to tell parents that too, that if your child is given feedback, if they're given partial credit, if everything is less abstract and more in the moment, that's going to help the teacher figure out how to help that student. That's going to help the parent understand their child. So there's a lot of benefit to this.
I'm curious I always like to put that hat on back at the beginning of my career. And like when I left grad school, I felt like my knowledge about all these processing terms was like, I kind of sort of got it, but please don't ask me too many follow-up questions. So I'd love for us to kind of talk to those school psychologists listening. When we think about something like Ravens or a matrix reasoning kind of task versus, this assessment of nonverbal contextual reasoning, where do we see that connected in the school setting? How would you explain to a parent, like you mentioned, their formal reasoning was this score, this is their contextual reasoning. How would we go to that next step and say, and this explains this in the school setting, and this explains this in the school setting? How would you explain that to a parent or a newer school psych?
Well, academically, not everything is abstract reasoning throughout the day. There's a lot of practical, concrete, and contextual reasoning. A couple examples would be reading comprehension. Yes, there's inferential reasoning in reading comprehension, but even there, you're basing it on context cues. And so academically, reading comprehension is a good example of contextual reasoning because you have to go with the immediate information provided in that passage. And even Richard Woodcock, when he did refer to contextual reasoning, he often referred to it within the context related to reading comprehension. I think it'll also show up in written expression. There's a lot of reasoning, planning, organization, obviously executive functions and written expression as well. But still, there's kind of a problem-solving process. We haven't used that word too much, but contextual reasoning, is often what we're using during problem solving. And so it lends itself really well in those two areas. Of course, math is a combination of abstract, but there's also concrete contextual reasoning in math, especially on the story problems. You may not know how to write an equation or use symbols, but you could use, contextual reasoning and kind of put the pieces together. And so it's not alien to the classroom. And the learners who are more contextual learners, they're going to benefit from more problem-based kind of learning or group learning, that type of thing. Carl, I know you have thoughts on this too.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, 100% of what you're saying, Dr. Dehn. I would also say, when we look at the data, kids with ADHD do surprisingly well on this. All right.
Okay.
We're not making sure that they have to remember everything and remember these steps. And when you remember these steps, you can solve this problem. And if you get so many wrong, you're out. The kids with ADHD seem to benefit from giving a little bit more slack. They're going to learn by making mistakes, right? Some of our kids do that. And the formal system we have set up isn't always accommodating to kids who learn by making mistakes, but that's just how some of us learn. So understanding and seeing, how does this child function when feedback is given, when mistakes are made, and then we show the child how to sort of recover that. That's going to go into the class, and we're going to be able to see how this student is going to learn best. Some teachers may get discouraged because the student just doesn't seem to get it. How many times have we heard that? The student gets it, but the student has a different way of teaching him or themselves the material. You could tell this student how many times what the rules are, and they're still probably going to do something, see how it worked. If they make a mistake, let's modify our methods. And so forth. So outside of the academic skills that Dr. Dehn was talking about, just the practice and how each student is different and how some students really benefit from this style of learning and processing.
Well, I know one of the things that school psychologists always bring up is our lack of time, right? We're always trying to find ways to become as efficient as possible. So can you talk about some of the logistics in regards to this new test? Like, how long does it take to administer it? Is this something that a school psychologist is easily going to be able to understand how to administer? Because it sounds like it's set up a little bit differently than a lot of the tests we might have already been exposed to.
Dr. Dehn, as we've been working on this, Dr. Dehn has been very, very aware of that, of the time. Is it easy to learn and administer? Yes, this assessment, Dr. Dehn, you can jump in too, but this assessment, we've had people pick it up. Within about 2 hours, learn how to give it.
Okay.
There's a higher tolerance for error. It's an amazing tool. It's not hard to learn. Dr. Dehn, I jumped in. There's that impulsivity. So you go.
Well, first of all, it's completely digital, so you don't need any paper, and it's automatically scoring itself. You just click on their answers. Most of their answers, it's pretty much a limited verbal test, where basically all they need to do is give you a letter or number, or they can point. And we can accept answers in any language. And it's already ready to go in Spanish. It has the Spanish instructions, right in the administration and the Spanish answers. And so it's going to be 4 subtests. If you give all 4 subtests, be about 30 minutes. It's also going to have a 2 subtest screener that kind of gets at the essence of it. 2 subtests. That should only be 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes with your setup, getting it up on screen. It uses the standardized digital procedures that all the other companies are using, where the child sees the stimuli on a separate device and you're scoring on a different one. So that, yeah, it's really, the examiners have picked it up quickly. It's pretty easy to administer and score.
Well, on behalf of school psychologists who need to learn new tests, thank you for keeping that in mind, because it seems like I have so many students in my mind as we've been talking that I think this would be very appropriate for that I work with. And so knowing that this supplement is not going to take another, 3 hours or something like that to get this really necessary information so we get a better picture of our students.
And Dr. Dehn, I want to throw in there, the examinees, we can't forget, the examinees enjoy it too.
Okay.
The feedback that we've been given by the examiners, the examinees stay engaged. It presents itself like I'm not going to say computer game, because that's really, really fun, but it presents itself as a computer activity that the kids can jump in and just do, like number munches, Oregon Trail, things like that. It's educational, right? You're still playing a game though. That fun stuff.
So we don't want to tell kids we're about to play a video game, right?
Well, they might get upset, video games, or yeah.
I just think about how many people were trained to have kids come on in. We're going to play some games together. And then I'm like, these aren't really like the games you're thinking they're going to be at all. Yeah. Block design is not as fun of a game that you think it's going to be as I think it is. Yeah.
The Congress CPT. Don't tell them that's a game. They will not be happy. That's a 15-minute, this is a game? Really?
It's a horrible game. It's a horrible game. Very valuable, but a horrible game to play. Yes, I have students yelling at me during that tool sometimes. When will this be over? I'm like, keep going, keep going.
Right.
So when is this tool going to be available for people to purchase?
We're taking preliminary orders now. Pre-orders get a 10% discount, but certainly by the end of October, we are putting the norms tables together now. It's already programmed, and then we have to build the norms tables into the program to generate the scoring report. And the manual is going to be PDFs, so when we're finished writing it, it's ready to go. Yeah, and the ducks are in a row to get it finished up here, and we may follow up with some, special studies right away on special populations we were not able to reach, such as Native Americans and others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions I was just thinking about when we were talking about the different populations for our students, what about working with our students who have more of the more cognitive delays? Have you done a lot of, the norming with students across all of the different cognitive skills?
We have good samples for learning disabilities, but cognitive disability per se is another special study that we'll have to dig in more deeply. We have a good ADHD sample, and it seems to me I'm missing one, Carl, LD.
ASD sample too.
So that's a start. And yeah, it's not a typical profile that we often expect, although kids with SLD, for example, are often, pretty good with reasoning and fluid reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just going to get better performance out of them as well with the type of feedback, encouragement that they get throughout the test.
Well, and I know that I mentioned before we started recording, I've been to your live presentations at a state conference. I've also listened to the recorded one. If school psychologists, if listening to this podcast is the first time they've heard about this test, how do they find more information about, the background of the tests, as well as some of those cool subtests that you've already been talking about?
On our website, the Schoolhouse Educational Services website, if they go to the webinars page, and it might be still near the top of the homepage, it will show a May recording of a webinar that Carl and I did on this, free access to that. There's also an article on the website, similar to an article that was published in the CAS publication earlier this year. So if you're a CAS member, it's available there. Carl, remember the exact title of that CAS article?
No, I have to dig that out. I don't want to mess that one up. Let me take a look here while we're talking.
And we can go ahead and include in the show notes a link directly to that webinar on the website, as well as that article. For people who aren't members of the California Association of School Psychologists, sound like that article is available on your website as well. Wonderful. Well, I know that we have a lot of newer school psychologists, as I mentioned, who are listeners. Reflecting back to when you were a first-year school psychologist, what advice would you give to someone starting out in this field?
Listen to the feedback you get on your first position, because we're going to learn a lot more, and you're going to learn it rapidly, if you're going to do well during that internship year. And it's like, what? They didn't mention this in my graduate study. This is the real world now. This is the way we do it. This is the information we need. And, you need to be able to explain it. So, that feedback from all of your team members and colleagues, and I'm talking not about school psychology colleagues, but the other professionals in the school setting. I learned lots from speech pathologists and special ed teachers, and not just about criteria and so on, but, good psychology as well. So yeah, listen to all of those experts in the schools, and that's going to be a big part of your learning curve.
Yeah.
Carl, what would you add?
Well, I don't want to sound too robotic and repetitive here, but again, 100% on what Dr. Dehn said. And if I wanted to, or if I had to add to that, I would think back to when I was a first-year school psych, and I remember knowing that, I might not be the smartest person in the room. I might not be the wittiest person in the room or have the highest credentials, but I knew I could work harder than anyone in that room. So be a hard worker, work as hard as you can. And, I remember I used to work for a company where we had a few different psychs, and there was one psych that worked there, and she had her own style, but she would often say the phrase, "That's not my job." And I remember that was like nailed on a chalkboard to me. And everyone, like I said, everyone has their style, but you know, doing a little bit extra that isn't necessarily under your job title is not going to hurt. Be a team player, right? Now, I'm not saying you have to spit shine admin shoes every day and run errands for them. No. But if something needs to be done and someone's not there to do it, even if it's not what you think your job is, just jump in and do it. Work a little bit harder. That's never going to hurt you. There's an old saying, I think Harvey McKay said it, the harder you work, the luckier you will get. Minnesota business guy from a long time ago. So that's what I would say. Just jump in, work as hard as you can, work harder than other people in the room if you can. And yeah, that's it.
Awesome. This podcast is called The Prepared School Psychologist. When you think of that term prepared, what do you do to help yourself feel more prepared in your roles that you're in right now?
Go ahead, Carl.
So that's a really good question. Obviously, stay up to date with what's happening in the field, newer tools that you're using, newer methods, this and that, but also look outside your role too. I remember when I was a practicing psych, I always wanted to know what the general ed teachers were doing, what the ELL teachers were doing, because we're working together. We do operate in different capacities or in different silos, we'll call it, but it never hurts to know what are they doing, because an ELL student who's having difficulties is one meeting away from being a student that you are going to assess, do interventions on, things like that. So always staying up to date on what they're doing, going to meetings with these folks, hanging out with them, asking them what's new in their world, right? Because we're all going to work together at some point, and waiting for the time where a problem happens or a need comes up. Sometimes it's a little bit too late to get to know our colleagues and get to know what they're doing. Be proactive with that, right?
Well, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, read professional information from your state and national organizations. They have wonderful publications that are keeping us up to date on trends and issues and all of that. We don't have to read formal research journals, although, when you find something interesting, those articles are important, but just reading what your organizations are putting out are going to help you stay up to date on that research as well. So that's really, really important.
And Dr. Dehn, that based per what you're saying too, reading reading other professions' literature too, that's part of how this all got started. Some of the research that was done by a woman named Dr. Helene Marshall from Long Island University, lots of good research out of her. So reading her research, reading what's new in her world, based kind of like what Dr. Dehn is saying, that the information and the knowledge you're going to get to make you better at your profession. We have catapulted forward because of a lot of the work that other folks have done that we read that we are applying to our discipline.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being on the podcast today. And I want to thank all of my listeners for listening to another great episode. So until next time, everyone, have a great rest of your day. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.